all of them are listed here on the slide. So I wanted to say a big thank you to all of them for their core support to this series. I'll just run through a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The first is that I have everybody on mute. We have about 90 people signed up for the webinar today, and there's a couple of live viewings, so we don't want to get distracted by everybody's background noise. To deal with questions, we'll use the chat box, which some of you are already using. At the end of the presentations, I'll serve as the moderator. I'll read out the questions as they come in, and the speakers will be able to answer them. And note, too, that you can also start a private conversation with one person. If you see a name on the screen that you'd like to make a connection there, that's how you can do that. And now is actually a nice opportunity for you to introduce yourself in the chat box and perhaps give a weather update from your region. We're all scattered around BC, so it's kind of nice to get to know who's in this virtual space. So if you could just type in who you are and what organization you're with, maybe how many people are with you in the room, that would help us feel a little bit more like a community. Very quickly, I'll just highlight the goals for today. So first, what we're really aiming for is to look at a fairly high level, an overview of monitoring and reporting issues and themes in British Columbia. And what I'm hoping is that this webinar sets the stage and the lead-in for further discussions, which might be more technical and focused. I think from the conversations that we've been part of, it's really clear that the conversation around monitoring and reporting cannot avoid details and nuance, and that the weeds are actually really inevitable and they're crucial when we're talking about data and information monitoring. But those details are not the focus of today. Today, again, is about painting the big picture in terms of a direction for monitoring and reporting to support good governance. And there are many perspectives and lessons learned from regional initiatives, First Nations-led initiatives, industry, community, government programs, and all of these individuals will need to be engaged in the conversation in a very upfront way. And this webinar by no means gets at all of those perspectives, all of the issues around data and knowledge, but we're helping to keep this discussion on the table and try to move it forward. And following this webinar, Polis can help convene some of those follow-up discussions. We can use this platform if that makes sense. In a small group, this platform can be used very interactively. So at the end of this webinar, I'll put up a live poll question to gauge the room's interest in participating in some of those follow-up conversations. So with that, we have three really fantastic speakers lined up today. And let me just introduce you to them. So the first resource guest we're going to hear from is Liz Hendriks. And Liz is a policy expert. She has over 10 years of experience working nationally and internationally, much of that work in sustainable management of water and watershed resources. And she's been a leader in BC water conversations, such as around community-based water monitoring, protection of environmental flow regimes, and today she'll talk to us about some of the WWF-Canada's latest work in watershed assessment. Our second speaker is Katrina Connors, and Katrina is the director of the Skeena Salmon Program at the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and I think probably most of the people on the line are familiar with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. It's a charitable nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation and restoration of wild Pacific salmon and their natural habitats in BC. So Katrina will be talking to us specifically about the Skeena Salmon initiative. And Katrina's been working in the Skeena for quite some time. Prior to being with Pacific Salmon Foundation, her work was supporting a multi-sectoral governance initiative in the Skeena watershed. And Katrina is also currently pursuing her doctorate at Royal Roads University, so we're delighted she can be with us. And finally, Ben Kerr is joining us, and Ben is the CEO and Senior Water Scientist at Foundry Spatial in Victoria. He leads the team of scientists and developers in creating the next generation decision support tools that he'll be telling us more about today and giving us a quick look at. So Ben has a diverse background in multiple resource industries. He uses his expertise in hydrology and data science to connect billions of pieces of data with intuitive and flexible interfaces. And that helps people more quickly and easily make sustainable decisions about water. And Ben is our discussant today, so I've asked him to tell us a little bit about the tools his team has developed, but also to provide some reflections based on his own expertise and knowledge, and also from the 2 previous presentations. And today we're really making use of our virtual space. So there's 2 others on the line who I've asked to be here who won't be speaking, but I wanted to briefly introduce their work and invite them to use the chat box to provide their perspective in response to some of the questions that we're going to explore during the Q&A. The first person is Celine Davis. Celine is tuning in from Victoria. She's the Manager of Watershed Science in the Water Protection and Sustainability Branch at BC Ministry of Environment. And Celine works on incorporating sound science into water standards, policy, and legislation. And she has over 20 years of experience in watershed environmental assessment, monitoring, and reporting and policy development. And Celine's been very engaged in the conversation with this community. For example, she was at the Watersheds 2016 forum and has a lot to share with this group. So it's great that she can be here, and she provided some links which I will share in the discussion time. The other person I'll introduce briefly is Martin Carver. And Martin is a hydrologist and a conservation planner. He also has over 20 years of experience in Western Canada looking at water resources and the impacts from land use practices. He's the author of a science report coming out this month through the Columbia Basin Trust that details the water monitoring situation in the Upper Columbia Basin in relation to expected impacts of climate change. So Martin, through the question and answer, may be able to provide some regional perspective. So I really wanted us to think about Celine and Martin as being part of an additional kind of panel of expert resource guests who are going to contribute to the conversation now and also certainly in the future. These are people we'll learn a lot from. So with that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Liz Hendriks. So Liz, if you just want to press *6, you'll be unmuted and you can go ahead.
Hi everyone. Unless I see otherwise in the chat box, I'm going to assume everyone can hear me fine. So first of all, thank you very much to Polis, the Polis Project, for inviting me today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Today I'm going to speak to our National Scalable Freshwater Reporting Tool, and we'll provide an overview of information gaps and some of the solutions and tools available to improving watershed monitoring and reporting at the provincial scale. So collectively, Canada's rivers make up 25 major watersheds, each brimming with stories of history, culture, ecology, and economy. Yet as a country, we are missing an important part of that story. At a national level and within many provinces, we don't know how healthy our rivers and watersheds are or what threats they currently face. Without this knowledge, at any scale, we can't triage, can't assess progress on the state of our water, restoration, or health programs. We also don't have a full picture of what our provincial or national monitoring systems really look like. Where are the strengths, the gaps, and how are we moving the mark on our freshwater resources? The watershed reports are made up of the freshwater threats assessment that works with the freshwater health assessment to provide a full picture of the health and threats of our freshwater. The health assessment provides the current state of the freshwater ecosystem health by collecting short and long-term trend data from on-the-ground organizations and governments. The threats assessment leverages national databases which illustrates the impact of human change on aquatic habitats at a national scale. So the map you're looking at is the completed threats assessment to date. The light gray indicates where we still have to assess. Our watershed assessment is a nationally peer-reviewed methodology that took roughly 2 years to create, but it has been an iterative process over 4 years because as we've completed watershed reports, we underwent a local peer review process, which has in some cases allowed us to refine our methodology. Our assessment is also meant to be a report of the state of water or act complementary to other local watershed reports that allow governments to report out at different scales. So given the time in today's webinar, I will just focus on our health assessment because I think it's the most relevant to the discussion. Our health assessments are centered around defining good ecological health for aquatic habitat, looking at 4 indicators: fish, hydrology, water quality, and benthic invertebrates. We assign a score from very good to very poor, and we also assess data sufficiency. So there needs to be a threshold of data to assess a score with any certainty. Today, we have assessed 75% of the major watersheds of Canada and will complete the remaining watersheds by June 11, 2017. The results of this detailed analysis are available at watershedreports.wwf.ca. And we also measure, as I said, data sufficiency. And this means is there long-term rigorous data sets required to make an appropriate assessment. And the question of data sufficiency is critical in creating monitoring programs and reporting to the program because it is the key to identifying gaps in prioritization and investment, which I will discuss further in the recommendations section. And here I just zoomed in to give folks a shot of BC and the subwatershed of the Pacific Coastal. So at a finer scale, you do see that the results of data sufficiencies change. And I will, here are kind of the high-level results of sub-watershed results of BC. So we looked at 6 major watersheds. 2 watersheds health was rated as very good, 2 watersheds health rated at good, 1 watershed health rated at fair, and 1 watershed was, overall larger watershed was data deficient. But when you looked at the sub-watershed results, most data deficient areas were around water quality and benthic. So through our assessment, we can say in monitoring, these are gaps that you'd want to focus, and there's we've created this measurement tool that allows us to say, and this is where the investment needs to happen first. So what does this all mean for BC? And ultimately, it's how do we create a robust monitoring network that accounts for the geographic size of the province and the fragmented nature of management. And to report on the state of water, assessments need to be clear, concise, and told in a way that is meaningful for the public. So from WWF's experience over the past 3 years or 4 years of doing our own assessments and working provincially and as well as nationally, a few of our experiences have led us to we have bigger recommendations, but I focused just a few specifically that I think would be worthwhile for this discussion. So this issue of coordination and integration. Hurdles that we've come across in coordinating efforts include inconsistent protocols, diversity of partners in monitoring, varied reliability levels of the data collected, numbers of indicators versus parameters at different scales, real-time versus monthly or annual reporting, and the changing nature of data has caused issue with getting kind of solid base of data. So we really see that a better coordination and collaboration among more partners is required. The opportunity is, in this, is standardizing data collection and reporting, and also mitigating hurdles to allow for the greater local regional integration and comparison across regions. So there are places where this is happening, and I've drawn from examples not just in BC, but I think, take a bigger pool of examples. So I've looked at Living Lakes and has a great program, and they're one of the few organizations that actually are trained to do cabin monitoring with volunteers. And this monitoring is important because it goes into, it's not just citizen science for the sake of citizen science, it's data that then goes into an established database. On the East Coast, CBMEN, which used to be Cura H2O, has a great local to regional to national network. And then in Ontario, and so, their network allows for consistency in that scale of data collection. And then in Ontario, the Federation of Ontario Community Cottage Association works with the Ministry of Environment to collect water quality data across the province. So of course, always, especially, speaking to that issue of data sufficiency, the issue of availability. So we have cuts in continuity and coverage and representation. So with cuts in continuity, the trend and challenges that with government cutting back on monitoring, community-driven groups appear to be taking on a greater responsibility, which is important to support long-term programs and data sets. And also coverage and representation. Monitoring stations aren't necessarily represented statistically, so the opportunity is to support long-term monitoring to ensure that continuity, and this must be a collaborative effort involving First Nations, government, academia, industry, and communities to ensure the coverage as well as the continuity. And we're not saying more is necessarily better, but the opportunity to extend coverage in areas of risk or high deficiency. So again, understanding where your deficiencies is helps you prioritize where you actually need to extend coverage. And then some interesting places where they're working on these challenges is, again, Living Lakes and the Cabin program are working towards coverage in their region. And also Lake Winnipeg Foundation doing some interesting community-based monitoring around phosphorus to ensure that it's not just one sample a season, but that they're training citizens to get out when phosphorus might be high or after extreme weather events, or ensuring that there's a consistency within the data required to make the appropriate analysis. I'm just going to pop it all up at once so I can focus on speaking. So finally, the issue around communication, and I think this is something we can all relate no matter what business you're at. Water interactions are transboundary and multifaceted. There's this limited ability to tell an entire story of an entire watershed with river data alone, while the assessment of threats helps to highlight interconnections. For WWF, there are many other metrics and data types, such as vegetation and invasive lake wetlands and groundwater interactions to tell ecosystem health. We also need to translate this raw data into something meaningful for people and ultimately policy or regulatory change. So the Watershed Reports are, for us, this great communication tool for the public, and we think it's an opportunity to integrate better with decision makers. And the opportunity, I think there are opportunities to expand indicators around watershed health, remembering that point about making it understandable for the public. So you don't want something so complex that it becomes meaningless to the public, who are ultimately the ones who need to understand what's happening. And really and you want your reporting and monitoring to really be building stewardship and ethics. So again, that conversion of, it's not just about raw data, but it's following the chain of command from raw data to reporting out to the public and decision making. So there's a complete circle, a feedback loop. And there are really good emerging opportunities, I think, nationally and wherever. So in BC as well, there's legislative reviews happening, and so the government is working really hard at implementing the BC Water Act in BC, or federally with the Fisheries Act and SIA reviews. I think there is this opportunity and willingness to really look at how monitoring is happening and how we might reprioritize. And also this importance of incorporating Indigenous knowledge. And there are in the north and some interesting case studies of how that can be done well that can be explored further. I think that's it for me. I think we take questions at the end. So I do want to thank our, with lots of support from a wide range of folks across the country, foundations and HSBC. So I want to take the time to thank our supporters, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks for that overview. Katrina will be our next speaker, and she'll take some of these, I think a number of the concepts that Liz has put out here for us and ground them a little bit in the context of the Skeena. And I can see you've unmuted, so I think you're okay there, Katrina, to get started.
Okay, yeah.
Perfect,
Thanks.
yep.
Okay, hi everyone. It's a little blustery still in Vancouver right now, which is kind of fun until you have to get home from work, but hopefully everyone's doing well. So as Natasha said, I'm going to be talking about some of our efforts here at the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and specifically efforts that we've been undertaking to strengthen capacity for monitoring and reporting in the Skeena River watershed. And perhaps not surprisingly, being with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, I'm going to talk about our monitoring and reporting efforts related to salmon, but also their freshwater habitat. So just a little bit about PSF. I know Natasha covered a little bit in the intro, but essentially we're a non-governmental organization that focuses on the conservation, restoration, and enhancement of Pacific salmon populations and their habitats. And we work throughout British Columbia and the Yukon. Our most well-known program is our Community Salmon Program, which provides about $1.5 million each year to volunteer and community-driven organizations that undertake salmon conservation projects. In more recent years, PSF has also been leading a number of salmon science and research initiatives throughout BC. And these efforts are really quite varied, and they range from citizen science initiatives in the Salish Sea to watershed-specific research efforts, including our work in the Skeena watershed. So the Skeena Salmon Program falls under our science and research initiatives at PSF. We first became involved in the Skeena back in 2007, when at the time we were asked by Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the BC Ministry of Environment to convene an independent science review panel. And this panel was tasked with a few objectives, one of them being to review the current management of salmon in the Skeena watershed, a second one being to recommend a renewed approach to fisheries management, and a third being identifying critical monitoring and data collection needs for salmon within the region. So the independent science panel came out with a final report which included a number of recommendations, including the need to address the critical data gaps that they had identified, the need to establish a number of new salmon monitoring programs, and also the need to establish a watershed-scale governance body to help arbitrate over ongoing conflicts in the watershed related to salmon management. So it was in response to this last recommendation around watershed governance that PSF was asked to provide Secretariat support to a new multi-sectoral watershed governance initiative called the Skeena Watershed Initiative. And this initiative ran for a few years, from 2009 to 2011, and while there was some good progress made, particularly related to collecting baseline data for Skeena salmon, a number of groups that were involved felt that the governance initiative was a bit premature and that the discussions that were occurring needed to be built on a more robust foundation of information for Skeena salmon. So when the governance initiative ended in 2011, PSF established the Skeena Salmon Program, and we carried on with some more monitoring and research efforts working with communities. And so since then, we've been working to try and expand the baseline of information that's available for wild salmon, and then in turn use this information to assess the biological status of wild salmon populations and their freshwater habitats. And being a nonprofit organization, we strive to make the information we collect and the analyses we undertake freely and broadly accessible to the public. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a map of northern British Columbia, and you can see an outline of the Skeena River watershed. The Skeena is the second largest watershed in British Columbia and the second largest salmon-producing river in Canada after the Fraser River. You can also see adjacent, I included a little bit of the Nass River area, and mostly this is just to highlight that we've been expanding our monitoring and assessment approaches to other salmon-bearing watersheds. So just this past year, we've been working with the Nisga'a First Nation and Skeena First Nations as well to collaboratively assess risks to freshwater salmon habitat. So one of the policies that's guided our efforts here in the Skeena from the beginning has been the Wild Salmon Policy, or the WSP. And this is a policy that was developed in 2005 by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And I'm not going to go into the details of the policy, but instead give you a bit of a Coles Notes version. So essentially there's 5 main strategies within the policy. And here on this slide I've listed the first 2. And as you can see, these first 2 at the core relate to monitoring and or assessment. And this is really where our efforts have been focused. So the first strategy is focused on standardized monitoring of salmon status, and the second one around the assessment of habitat status. And these 2 strategies have really provided a bit of a blueprint for what we monitor and what we report out on in the Skeena River watershed. And the medium that we've chosen for our reporting is an online data visualization platform called the Pacific Salmon Explorer. So for the next little bit, I'm going to be talking about a regional approach to monitoring and reporting in the Skeena River watershed by providing a brief overview of the Pacific Salmon Explorer. Ideally, I would do a live demo, but both Natasha and I thought it might be a bit too risky to do a live demo for this webinar. So I'm just going to be showing you a series of screenshots from this tool. But if you do have a chance afterwards, I've listed the URL at the bottom of the screen, so I encourage you to take a look. And I'm going to just warn you that I'm going to take a little bit of a head dive into the weeds here, as Natasha has warned, and I'm going to hopefully be able to bring us back out and make it relatable to this webinar, but just a little bit of a pre-warning there. So the first slide that I'm showing here is a landing page for the Pacific Salmon Explorer. And the main feature on this landing page is essentially a map of the north and central coast of BC. And you can also see an outline of the Skeena River watershed here. And the idea is that users navigate through the information on a watershed by watershed basis. And the Skeena watershed has been our prototype for testing this platform. But over the next year or 2, we're hoping to be able to extend this platform to other salmon-bearing watersheds throughout BC. So if you were to click on a map of the Skeena watershed, you would be taken to a screen like this. And at the top of the screen, I'll just show you a little red box that will appear. You can see a bit of a navigation menu where you can explore information on either habitat status, population status, or the Skeena River estuary. So right now I've selected population status, which allows me to see all of the biological information we've collected for all salmon populations in the Skeena. And the information we present is for all geographically and genetically distinct populations of salmon, which are known as conservation units, or CUs, under Canada's Wild Salmon Policy. And within the Skeena, there are 55 individual CUs, and throughout this tool, that's the scale or unit of analysis that we present information. So here on the left-hand side, you'll see a host of variables that relate to the status of salmon populations. And these include things like spawner abundance, catch and run size, trends in abundance, and so on and so forth. And the idea is that in this population status section, users can explore the different factors that influence the dynamics of salmon populations. And so from this page, users can click on any one of these 55 CUs to explore the more detailed information that exists. And so if you were to hover over, you'd get a little box that tells you about that particular conservation unit. And if you were to click on that, you'd be taken to a screen. And so here you can see a particular pink salmon conservation unit called the Nass Skeena Estuary. And here we're presenting a long time series of information, more than 60 years worth of data from 1950 to 2014, that basically tells us how many adult salmon made it back to the spawning grounds each year. You can also explore other metrics for this particular conservation unit, like harvest or catch. So in a given year, for example, you can see how many fish were captured in both U.S. and Canadian fisheries. And you can also hover over each of the individual years, and you'll get a little tooltip that pops up that gives you a breakdown of the exploitation rate and harvest by U.S. and Canadian fisheries in a given year. And a final element that I'll highlight is our assessments of biological status. And for this, we essentially applied commonly used metrics to evaluate the biological status. So if you look at the areas outlined in black, that basically shows you the spawning habitats used by that particular conservation unit. And then the green color indicates good biological status. And the idea is that users can explore the biological status of different conservation units within a species. And this is particularly helpful from a fisheries management perspective, as it allows managers to take action if the biological status of a CU changes over time. So for example, under the wild salmon policy, if a conservation unit falls into the red zone, management actions are supposed to be undertaken, which could include things like the development of recovery plans. So moving along, we also explore other things in addition to biological factors. We also explore the status of freshwater salmon habitats within the Skeena. And we did this by looking at a variety of human and environmental pressures on freshwater salmon habitats. More specifically, we looked and quantified the intensity and geographic extent of 13 different pressures that are known to cause physical and ecological changes to salmon habitat. And these indicators were examined both individually, but we also rolled them up to develop a cumulative risk score. And so here I'm just highlighting that I've clicked into the habitat status section, and then here at this, you can see this radio button is selected. That shows you the cumulative risk score. And this was all done primarily using remote sense data obtained from the province of BC, but also through local data sets that were provided. So just to highlight that we didn't do any on-the-ground monitoring, there was no field data that was used, but really that this is supposed to provide a synoptic overview or a broad-scale approach to looking at cumulative risk to freshwater salmon habitat. And for this particular project, we established a regional technical advisory committee to provide local input into the project. And this technical advisory committee was comprised of local First Nations, representatives from the BC Ministry of Environment, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and other experts in the watershed. And working with this technical advisory committee was very critical to this process, both in terms of ground truthing the draft results, but also in providing guidance on the project methodology, helping to refine it over time, and providing access to and awareness of local data sets. So this particular slide, if you look at the map of the Skeena watershed on the right, we're looking at all the spawning habitats used by all salmon conservation units in the Skeena watershed. And here in this shot, we're showing the cumulative pressures on spawning habitat. And users also have the ability to explore individual pressures. So if you were to click insect and disease defoliation, which is one of the 13 indicators that we looked at, you can see the map on the right changes. And so you can see for this particular indicate how the spatial extent and intensity for that particular indicator changes over time. Users also have the ability to select an individual conservation unit by clicking on this drop-down menu. And so here you can see all salmon species that spawn in the Skeena, and then the names underneath are the individual names of the conservation units. So if we were to click on a specific conservation unit, in this case we're looking at a coho. Lower Skeena is the name of the conservation unit, and so this allows you to look at the cumulative pressures for a particular CU or conservation unit. For the habitat assessments I showed, it's important to note that we did not consider any of the risk associated with future pressures in the watershed, but this is something that many of the Technical Advisory Committee members had asked of us. So one of the things that we have done is mapping all of the current, but also the proposed industrial infrastructure projects in the Skeena. And these development projects were grouped into high-level categories that you'll see on the left, including things like oil and gas pipelines, mining development, and so on and so forth. And the idea for these Technical Advisory Committee members was that they want to understand where some of these projects intersect with freshwater salmon habitats. And the idea is that it would be a useful input into different land use planning discussions that were occurring, and also for working with proponents of development and different levels of government to come up with strategies for minimizing additional risk or future pressures on freshwater salmon habitat. So on this slide, you can see on the left in the teal color, the icons indicate existing infrastructure on the landscape, and the orange icons show future pressures that are anticipated for the region. And so we also show this information at the watershed scale. So again, you can see current and future pressures. And the idea is that you can interact and hover over each of the icons, and you can get a little bit of information. Much of this is sourced from the province of BC, but you can get the information that tells you a little bit about what you're seeing, you know, the commodity that may be harvest, and there's different things that relate to water licenses and that sort of thing as well. So an additional feature throughout the tool is that users have the ability to print directly any of the figures or graphs that they see directly from the platform. So if you look at the top right-hand corner of the tool, right here where the circle is showing, you'll see a little bit of text that says export as a PDF. And essentially clicking on this icon takes users to a data export menu where folks can select a particular conservation unit and generate a PDF report. So if you were to select an individual conservation unit, you would have this nice message that tells you to hold on or to keep browsing. And then the output is a PDF report. And these PDF reports summarize all the habitat and the population status information that's shown within the Pacific Salmon Explorer. It also includes appendices, which has all the citations and references that are included. And throughout the tool, users also have the ability to just select single graphs or figures. They don't have to get all the information at once. So that's something that's also available. And if you go back to the screen, I've circled in the top right-hand corner again something that says download data. So I just want to highlight that throughout the tool, you also have the ability to click that at any time, and it takes you to PSF Salmon Data Library. So if you were to click on that, it would take you to our data library on our website. And this would be the landing page for that. And if you were to go inside, you have opportunities to either search for data by keyword on the left-hand side, or you can browse different categories that we have identified. So if you choose something that says boundaries and base layers, then you'll get all of the data holdings, and you can scroll and click on each of these data holdings, and then you have the ability to export the raw data sets directly from that. For all the data that we source from the province of BC, in those cases, users will be redirected to the source URL, and we make sure that the province remains a authoritative source. But there are many data sets we have that have been either provided by local communities, either through the Technical Advisory Committee or by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, that are not readily accessible to the public. And so in these cases, we allow these data sets to be directly downloaded from our data library. So I think that's it for the weeds and my attempt to kind of do a very quick and brief overview of the Pacific Salmon Explorer. Again, if you have the time, I encourage you to check it out for yourself, as there's lots more information than I've been able to cover just now. But just to summarize a bit in terms of the application of the Pacific Salmon Explorer and the work that we're undertaking, I think there are a number of key benefits and potential applications. So more specifically, the Salmon Explorer provides a way for local communities to better understand the geographic extent and intensity of different human environmental pressures. It also provides a way for users to understand what cumulative risks might be for freshwater salmon habitats and what those future pressures may be on salmon habitats as well. And ideally, all of this information can be used to help local communities and decision makers develop strategies and approaches for alleviating the current stresses on freshwater salmon habitat, and also for working with proponents of development to mitigate the impacts of future pressures. It can also help to identify more details on the ground monitoring may be required. So for example, if there are limited resources available for detailed monitoring, it can allow governments or local communities to focus their efforts perhaps on high-risk areas. It can also contribute to conversations around the siting of future resource development projects, perhaps by avoiding development in areas that are facing high cumulative risks already. And perhaps most importantly, it provides public access to data holdings that are at times either hard to locate, particularly for information on abundance and other population metrics, and provides more information that can contribute to more productive conversations by building a common baseline of information for folks to work off of. So just to wrap up, I'd like to maybe offer one or two thoughts for how BC could move forward to ensure watershed governance is based on a foundation of robust information. So with all the work we do, we really try and establish regional technical advisory committees that are comprised of local experts and knowledge holders. And this really is something that's been critical, not just for helping to validate the results of some of the work we do, but for also looking for more formal linkages and ways to harmonize monitoring approaches in the watersheds and to integrate some of the local data sets that are being collected by community members. The other piece is around securing ongoing access to current and the best available data. So this is not something that can be done just from a technical perspective. It's really about building those partnerships with governments, First Nations, local communities to ensure that the data that is being collected does have a way to making it to others that also have an interest in using that information. And finally, just around sharing information, making sure that the information and the data that is provided is well documented and broadly and easily available to the public. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I know I did go a little bit into the weeds there, but hopefully I haven't lost too many people, and hopefully I've been able to give you a sense of where our monitoring and assessment efforts have really been focused on in the Skeena over the past several years.
Thanks, Katrina. That was really helpful, and I'm impressed with, I mean, you certainly kept my interest through the details, so I really appreciate that. And I can see there's already questions coming in about the tool that we'll have to get to in our question period. But before we go there, I'd like to turn it over to Ben Kerr to talk a little bit about his programs, which I think some of his core messages will complement what Katrina's presented and give us a little bit more to think about. So take it away, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha, and thank you for having me today. Thanks also, Liz and Katrina, for those first two presentations. Those are great. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is some of our tools that we have up and running to help support decision-making around water in BC. And these were developed because there's obviously decisions being made about the use of our fresh water in rivers, lakes, and streams. And it's sometimes hard to get access to the data that's required to really understand the context of those decisions. And that's not just an issue for government, it's also an issue for the proponents who are wanting to use the water, and also First Nations and communities who have an interest in the sustainable management of our water. So there's two things that I'm going to show today. I'm not going to do a demo either, just because it's a little risky for doing through this webinar format. But the first tool is what's called the Water Portal. And the objective there is really to bring together monitoring information from thousands of locations where data has been collected, and it's sometimes hard to find in databases that are scattered around. And so what we've done is bring together monitoring data from a whole bunch of different organizations and bring them together in one clean and simple interface where it's straightforward to find. You don't need to have any sort of organizational expertise in terms of who collected the data or why or when. You can just go there and access the data that you need. And then the second one is what we call the Water Tool, and the objective there is to help people understand the water supply and demand picture for literally millions of watersheds across Western Canada. So those places where there is no monitoring data that exists around stream flow, people can get access to results from a model that suggests how much water there is there, when the water is there, and then also how much water has already been licensed, and put that all in the context of what the environmental flow needs of the streams and rivers are. And so the guiding principles that we really try and follow when we develop these tools is really to think about the user first. So in our private labs, we have access to so many great, easy-to-use tools on the internet that help us with all different kinds of aspects of our life. And the goal is really to make access to monitoring information and scientific information about water just as easy, and to integrate a whole bunch of data so that people are saved time. They don't have to go to a dozen or dozens of different places to get it. So the first one I'm going to show is the Caribou Water Tool. The URL is at the top of the slide there if you'd like to go and check it out for yourself. And what the screen's showing right now is the streamflow monitoring locations that exist across the Caribou region of central BC. So right in the middle of the map there is Williams Lake. The region is mostly within the sort of middle section of the Fraser River. And all those little points on the map represent where there's streamflow data that has been collected that we have in the database. So the map markers, sort of the droplet shape, are individual locations, and then the circles are where there's clusters of locations. And the number inside the cluster tells you how many there are, and those colors represent what the status of those monitoring locations are. So the orange ones, that's where the monitoring station is active and actively sending data. So those locations you can click on and see what the current streamflow condition is. The dark blue are ones that are active but not in communication to the system. And then the blue ones are, or the light blue is where there's historical monitoring data available, but those stations are no longer active. And this screen shows what you get when you click on one of those locations. So this is a small creek up by Quesnel, which has been active for about 50 years. And what this chart shows is the historical trends in streamflow. And what I've done is overlay one individual year there. So in green is 2009, and then in the blue color is this year's current streamflow. So you can see how this year tracks in relation to the historical averages. And then you can also, if you're interested in comparing how this year compares to a year that you're familiar with, in terms of understanding how it might relate to that historical time. Within this tool as well, you can download charts. So you could save that image that you're looking at on the screen if you wanted to include that in a report, for example. You can also download the data itself if you want to do further subsequent analysis. So those dozens of monitoring locations that we have in here, you can access that data as well as visualize it within the interface. Now switching over to the second half of the tools that I mentioned at the start, what this screen is showing is the Northeast Water Tool. So this was the first tool that we developed about 4 years ago now. It's in the northeast corner of the province, and what this does is it lets you basically just find the location that you're interested in. So that can be down to, say, a couple hundred meters resolution along a stream or a river, and simply click on that water body that you're interested in, and the system will define the watershed associated with that water body, and then it'll produce a report for you describing how much water there is on average over the course of the year, the existing allocations of water that have been made, and the environmental flow needs of that water body based on the Ministry of Environment Environmental Flow Needs Policy. Also within the report, you'll get a whole bunch more information on the actual characteristics of the watershed. So that's things like the topography, the land cover composition of the watershed, the historical climate, as well as projections for what the climate might look like in the future in terms of what changes might we see to temperature, precipitation, and snowfall. And that really helps put the water allocations decision into the context of a changing climate, so that you can start thinking about what impacts would reduced snowpack in the winter have on the timing and flow of water in the watershed. So this screen here is showing just a couple pages out of the report. It's typically like a 5 to 100 page report, depending on the size of the watershed and the amount of existing water users. on the left hand shows the cover page there, which basically just shows you the watershed, where the existing water applications are, and then at the top gives you a sort of a subway stop schematic representation of where you are and where that water flows to downstream. So in this case, we're on the Prophet River, and we end up flowing out into the Arctic Ocean. On the right-hand side is the hydrograph. So that's what the modeled flow in the Prophet River looks like over the course of the year. The green component of the bar is the environmental flow needs component of the hydrograph. The orange part at the top is what's been determined to be the threshold for the potential maximum allocation of water. And then there's a little black box right at the very top of that, which represents what the existing allocations are. So in this case, what this shows you is that the existing allocations in this watershed are just a very small piece of the total flow. This slide, we'll just talk quickly about what's made these tools and visualizations so successful. The key thing is that it's really easy to use. So in your regular life, most people likely have used Google Maps. You don't really need to consult a set of instructions there. You just go there and you use it and you find what you need. The same can be said for Airbnb. Those kind of services aren't typically provided with a manual, and we've taken the same approach here, so that there's no barrier to access. People don't need to invest a substantial amount of time understanding how to actually use the tool before they can access the information that they're looking for. A clear focus. So we understand the problem really well because we have the problem ourselves. Accessing monitoring data and coming up with reports for water supply and demand was a substantial component of the work we did before we started building these tools. And these really evolved from solving our problems, which it turns out our clients, partners, and stakeholders had the same problems. And there's always I guess a bit of a pressure when you're building these kind of things to try and do everything for everybody. And what we've found is that usually doesn't end up with a good result. If you try and do too much or try and bring in other components that are maybe not clearly 100% related to the initial objective, you could end up diluting the usefulness of what you end up producing. Both of these tools were developed to solve specific needs. So for the water tool, where we produce those watershed reports, the specific need was from the statutory decision maker. The volume of water use applications was much larger than it was possible to do one-off detailed studies for every application that was coming in. So the goal there was to provide a quick and easy way to give kind of a first pass look at how is this water use application how does it fit within the context of what we think the water availability is and how much we've already given away. And the fourth is high performance. So if you go and use these tools, you won't see any spinning loading animations. They will load quickly and you'll get access to the information that you're looking for quickly. So for example, in the hydrology report, you can navigate to any watershed across more than 1 million square kilometers of Western Canada and get a custom hydrology report in less than 10 seconds. And the time it would take you to do that in the absence of these tools would range from 2 days to 2 weeks for a professional hydrologist. So what's missing in terms of needs around water management in BC? There's lots more monitoring data out there that exists. So that's data that's either has been or is currently being collected by community groups. There's a huge amount of data out there associated with resource development projects from mining, forestry, and oil and gas. And there's potentially all kinds of other monitoring data out there as well. Groundwater has historically not been not been a big focus in BC. But as of 2016, as I'm sure most of you are aware, it's now regulated under the Water Sustainability Act. So to address this, we've been working on a couple things this year. One would be the Groundwater Review Assistant, which is coming out in Northeast BC in the next month, which is focused on, again, providing people with access to information around the groundwater resources of Northeast BC without having to go to 8 or 10 different locations, downloading the data and then looking at it themselves. They can just go, again, you just need to know where you're interested in and how big an area you want to search for around that. And then it'll produce a high quality report for you, similar to what came out of the Northeast Water Tool. And we've also been working on a project with hydrogeologists at the University of Victoria looking at new tools in terms of how to look at the effects of groundwater pumping on stream flow. That's based on the concept that surface water and groundwater are linked together, and the use of each should be considered together. What else is missing? Open sharing and strengthening partnerships. So what I really mean here about is it takes a lot of money to actually get out there and collect monitoring data on the ground, and it's typically been limited in terms of sharing and kind of multiplying the benefit, I guess, of that investment. So I'm a big believer in the benefits of open data. So if you're out there and you're collecting monitoring data, if you apply an open data license on that data, then other people can share it. They can understand what rights they have associated with it, and you can really achieve multiples on that investment that you're making. Land-based impact reporting. So all the water in the streams and aquifers comes from the sky. It's influenced by the conditions of the watershed that kind of that it flows through once it hits the ground. So all those activities in the watershed, whether that's land use, forestry, all those types of things influence water quality, aquifer recharge, and habitat. So there's currently nothing out there that really does a good job of looking at the cumulative impacts of land-based activities on watersheds. In the context that we have set up to produce these watershed reports, that's something that we could certainly do, though. And the fifth thing in terms of what's missing, these tools were spawned in northern BC and cover approximately 60% of the province right now, but they aren't yet available in the south. So yeah, that's again something else that's missing. And I think that's it for me. So I'll turn it back over to you, Natasha.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks again to all our speakers. I feel like the really strong theme throughout this discussion was that it is so hard to tell the whole story of a basin, really to pick up on what Liz said. And I think all of these tools start to give us some ways to tell the story, share the story in a compelling way to those who are making the decisions. So this was very insightful. And we have a number of questions that I think get to a number of other issues related to the use of these tools. So I noticed some of the questions coming in are pretty specific, and some may be a little outside the scope. The first question here from Hari, I think, is a very timely one, a good question related to oil spills in West Coast waterways. We might circle back to that question depending on our time, as we only have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So we'll go to the question from Julie Pisani in Nanaimo. Her question is, are there plans to extend the Pacific Salmon Explorer tool outside of the Skeena watershed? And I think that's a good specific question for Katrina, but I'd also like to turn that back to Liz after we've heard from Katrina to know, Liz, whether you see potential for the Salmon Explorer tool and the approach that Ben's described in other parts of BC or in Canada. So Katrina and Liz.
Yeah, well, thanks for the comment, Julie. And yeah, certainly there are plans to expand beyond the Skeena. We've started doing that in part. So I mentioned that we have been working with the Niska First Nation and other Skeena First Nations. So at this point, we have completed freshwater habitat assessments for the Nass River area. So that's kind of one component. So we're working or continuing to work with them to see if we can also complete and summarize some of the biological information. And then we also have plans to work with 4 First Nations communities on the central coast of BC starting next April. And so our hope is to be able to integrate those watersheds into the Pacific Salmon Explorer within a year after that. So that's kind of our short-term plans, but certainly looking ahead at the longer term, we've always built the infrastructure for the tool to accommodate additional watersheds, with the long-term vision being to include all salmon-bearing watersheds within the province of BC and potentially moving into the Yukon, which is also where PSF works. So certainly, yes, I think the biggest factors in determining how rapidly that occurs really depends on kind of the funding resources that we can kind of assemble to do that. But certainly it's in our long-term goal and vision.
Thanks, Katrina. And Liz, I'd be interested in your comment on that question too about how to scale out some of these different tools.
Yeah, thanks. I often say I think Canada is a country of regions, and we isolate ourselves within our region, and I think it's a huge disservice, and I think there is huge opportunities for all these tools to bring learning across the country. You know, groundwater mapping is a challenge across the country. Cumulative effects, so, you know, not every watershed is salmon producing, but the idea and the technology and the thinking behind that salmon, the tool is around cumulative effects, which is a live issue and a discussion across the country. And transferring that technology and learning is appropriate. I think it's just finding those outlets, but definitely it's always a good opportunity, and these webinars are great because you actually can see there are folks from across the country listening in, and I think it's great that there are these opportunities to learn outside of the regions that we work within.
Thanks, Liz. Okay, there's another really good question here. This one's from Susie Porterbop at First Nations Fisheries Council. The province of BC is developing monitoring and reporting regulations as part of the Water Sustainability Act right now. I think this is a question that could go to all the speakers. What are some of the key considerations that should be articulated in the regulations? So maybe we'll go reverse order this time. Ben, if you have a response, that'd be great, and Katrina and Liz. And as I mentioned, Celine Davis is on the line too. Celine, if you wanted to add a comment or thoughts in the chat box, you'd be welcome to do that.
Yeah. Monitoring and reporting associated with water usage, I think, is a big one. So right now, in the water tool, for example, we have information on what we know at stream flow monitoring locations. We have information on what we think the water availability is at different locations based on our models. And we also know about how much water has been licensed, but we don't have any information on how much water people are actually using from those licenses. So I think that is probably the most glaring hole in terms of the knowledge about water from the usage side. It came up earlier, I think Liz mentioned this as well too, around the how statistically well BC's water is being monitored. There's definitely opportunities there as well, and I think the future is, you know, we're not going to be able to measure everything everywhere, so it's really about coming up with a way to identify those places where we need really high quality monitoring information on the ground based on what's happening. So whether that's tied in with a resource development project or some other issue that's of concern, whether it would be salmon habitat, impacts from climate change, or something like that.
Yeah, so maybe I'll add to that just to kind of add to what Ben has said around water usage. I think for salmon, thinking around ecological flows, and I think the real challenge is, water quantity, and I think just kind of feeding back some of the anecdotal and observations that have been made by local communities is access to spawning habitat in kind of the late summer period. And so I think trying to provide ways to monitor and quantify water levels and water usage, I think would be something that would be useful at least from a salmon perspective.
So then I'll just jump in and add, this is Liz speaking, that I would say the piece around accessibility. So in the age of Google, and I know it's terrifying to, and there's lots of considerations, and I'm not putting this out there lightly, but I think accessibility around raw data opens more opportunities than the challenges that are around access to data. So as the point I was just going to make about in the age of Google, where information is quite accessible, wonderful solutions come about from access and allowing people to feel ownership and play around with the data. And so I think there is opportunity there in terms of building stewardship as well. British Columbia is flushed with very strong and knowledgeable organizations working on water, and so I think there's probably a lot of opportunity to have more than just government or industry trying to figure out solutions to some of today's challenges. So that would be a big piece.
That's a good segue to a question from Christine Metler, who works with Canadian Freshwater Alliance. She's wondering if Liz and Katrina can speak to the challenges and lessons learned with integrating local knowledge into the models. So for example, Liz, did you find big discrepancies between the data that you used and what local people then had to say about the assessments? Christine is interested in the iterative process that you noted and how you incorporated local knowledge back into these models. So I think that's a good segue for Liz, and then I'd be interested to hear Katrina's response to that as well.
It's a great question, Christina, and it definitely has been a challenge. So to Ben's point, you can't be everything to everyone. We definitely have grappled with that. So this program's been running 4 or 5 years now, and our indicators are based on understanding what we can get to at a national scale. So there needs to be, and to that point about data sufficiency, there had to be a fairly substantial level of data for us to feel comfortable going out and, making conclusions. And so some watersheds are definitely much more flush with data than others, and we had to find that happy medium. So I'm happy to report most watersheds, when we did our ground truthing, reflected fairly well what was happening. In some cases, we had a situation, where a community-based monitoring group had been working for 2 to 3 years, and then the watershed came out data deficient. And, we were so worried that, oh gosh, all their hard work, and we're just telling them it's not good enough. But for them, it was actually a way of them saying, look, this is why we need long-term monitoring, because 2 to 3 year monitoring programs isn't substantial enough, especially in the face of climate change. We need those long-term rigorous data sets. And so the community groups we spent the time ground truthing with really felt like, okay, well, this gave them a really good grounding to go forward, ensuring that their program would continue. Actually, Columbia Basin was a challenge for us because there was no pre-dam data, and so it comes out looking at the hydrology and the river flow, because there's nothing pre-dam. It isn't consistent, so we were able to make notes and had many discussions about, okay, well, how does that work? But I would say, thankfully, and I have to give my staff credit, we've spent a lot of time putting the time in ground truthing, especially with those folks who've really taken the time and were so appreciative to provide us data. We really, in respect of them, took the time to ground truth and, does it make sense? What if it didn't make sense? Why? And sometimes, there's calculation issues on our end, or sometimes all of a sudden, oh, here's an extra data set. Often, oh, here's more data that we didn't find. Or so mostly I feel like it's been okay. There's definitely some situations where we've had to kind of think through the communications or recognize the limitations of a national scale assessment, or provincially at a very local level sometimes doesn't make sense. But most of the time we've been able to explain it. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I think I gave you your answer.
Thanks, Liz. And Katrina, to that question of integrating the local knowledge, what are the challenges and how have you done that?
Yeah, so there certainly are many challenges. Mechanisms that we've used to try and integrate the information has been, as I mentioned, through technical advisory committees. That's not a substitute for integrating local information, but it does, provide a way to identify what local data sets exist. Often we ran into challenges just in terms of a scale mismatch in terms of the type of information. So as I mentioned, this is, at least on the habitat side, a very broad scale overview, and often a lot of the local data sets are much finer scale. So it is, or it can be challenging to integrate that information in a way that folks would like to see. Part of our approach within the Skeena is it's intended to be kind of a two-step or two-tiered approach where you start with this, high-level overview, and from that can allow folks to identify perhaps different kind of subbasins where they may want to focus. And then that's supposed to be where more on-the-ground detailed monitoring occurs. And so we've only been focused on this high level. That is the first step, but certainly that opportunity to integrate local data would come from those kind of local on-the-ground field monitoring programs. In terms of some of the lessons as well, I guess one of the things that is very apparent to us is that this needs to be kind of ongoing exercise, and so what we are attempting to do is kind of snapshots in time, but really treating this as a kind of ongoing commitment and kind of a living document to go and revisit and redo many of these analyses and this new information make themselves available. So that's a key piece for us. And then the final challenge maybe I'll speak to is that, trying to integrate local information is very important, often challenging, and often takes a lot of time. So what we found, at least for salmon populations within the Skeena, is that there's lots of great information that exists. Much of that information is in kind of hard copy technical reports that lives on someone's shelf, and so trying to create the space and the time to create kind of new spatial data sets that provide a way for this local information to be integrated is really important, but very time intensive.
Thanks, Katrina. And there's lots and lots of questions coming in here, so if I'm missing your question, I apologize. I'm hoping we can get to all of them, but I am jumping around a little bit, and if you think I've missed you, do just repost it. The next question I'll go to is from Oliver Brandes with the Polis Project. Wondering if the speakers can connect these various excellent tools and how they feel they are linking to the decisions on the ground. So the provincial decisions, licensing decisions, environmental assessment, Indigenous decisions, etc. He recognizes the NEWT is intended to be a support tool for provincial staff. Is that how it is happening? So I think this is relevant to everyone. Maybe we'll start with Ben and then back to Katrina and Liz.
Yeah, so in terms of the Salmon Explorer and how folks are using that and how they're using it to inform decisions on the ground, I think, some examples from some of the First Nations communities within the Skeena, the Gitniao First Nation as an example has been quite astute using a lot of this information to kind of inform their discussions, particularly with Fisheries and Oceans Canada over some of the abundance data that we present. And so they've had some success in terms of pushing to lower exploitation rates when potentially there is some suggestion that the biological status of conservation units that spawn within their traditional territories are maybe not faring so well, and so they've been able to kind of share the information that's been made available as a way to kind of negotiate or advocate for a particular position. The Gitnao have also been able to use some of the information from the indicators we've explored related to road density and that sort of thing to work with proponents of development, for example, that may be wishing to commission or install a new road within their traditional territory, and looking at ways to maybe decommission other roads if certain habitats are at higher risk, and so using that as a way to identify what potential risks are and trying to identify solutions or strategies for mitigating risk. So I think it's the biggest thing on a more general level is just, again, that access to information and having folks work off a common baseline. And I think, at least on the population side, often accessing some of the information on catch and how many fish return to spawn can be a challenge. And so just even having access to that, again, contributes back to more productive conversations that can be more focused on solutions.
And Ben, did you want to jump in there as well?
Sure. Yeah. So regarding how Newt is being used, the goal there is that it's a decision support tool, not a decision-making tool. So in the absence of a water tool existing, there's no quick and easy way for anybody to get in any sort of information on what the water supply could be in a watershed and what the existing water demand could be in that watershed also. So what it does is really gets the discussion around that decision, it moves it along. So it lets you put the proposed water use in the context of what an estimate of the water supply is. And what that does is it lets you give scale to the decision that's being asked of you. There is always the risk, of course, that when these tools exist, that people could potentially put too much faith in them, that's kind of a separate question, though. I think, I know I had a conversation with Oliver around this, around the legality of is a decision based on no data more legally defensible than a decision based on estimates? And I found that a really interesting conversation that I had with Oliver. Anyway, since I'm not a lawyer and he is, so. And then regarding the water portal, so the access to monitoring data, what the decision makers were hearing when they were making decisions was, how can you make a decision? There's no data available. So it's not the case, but to a casual observer who doesn't have expertise in terms of where to go and find information about streamflow monitoring, for example, it could appear that decisions are being made with no data. So the water portal, the goal really there was just to expose the data that exists, so that if people were concerned about what was actually known about water resources on the ground, that you could give them just one link. You wouldn't have to explain to them how to go to the Water Survey of Canada and navigate through, the 5 or 7 layers of menus that you need to get through to actually figure out that there is monitoring data that exists on a stream.
Thanks, Ben. Liz, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that it's a great question, and we've seen our tool being used not by government, but by other users, like I mentioned that organization. Oh, I do know of some government groups using it to rationalize, funding, increase funding, or point to the need of monitoring. I would say we haven't, and ask me this question again in 6 months, because we have only just now gotten to 75% of the watersheds across the country, so haven't actually been pushing this out, but without having completed all the work. We've been hesitant to really push publicly, but in the next 6 months, you know, I'd love to come back to this and have a better answer.
Okay, thanks. You'll have to keep us updated. I want to read out the comment that Martin posted because I think it contributes to this line of thought that we're on here. Martin's written, as we move along in making data more available, our expectations for advanced information products for decision support, like the ones that we've been looking at, will inevitably rise. And I think that, that must only be more true as we see what great tools are out there. Our BC ecosystems are complex and the data sets remain fairly sparse. So in the end, what Martin is suggesting is that we need to sort out what key analytical sub-products would be first useful and second reliable. So Newt has some ideas. We need to consider these and others and be clear on their assumptions and reliability. Which decisions need which sub-products, etc. So thanks for that comment, Martin. We are getting really close to the end of the webinar here, so I'll just take one more question. And thanks to Celine for being really active here in the chat box. There's a question up here from Maxine, and it's to Katrina. So this will be our last question for today. Does data collection and reporting distinguish between salmon who are reproducing naturally and those being artificially supported with release of hatchery fish?
Hi, yeah, that's a great question. So I guess the short answer is no, with a caveat. So for the Skeena, there's an enhanced salmon population, the Beans Conservation Unit. So that's something that the Technical Advisory Committee had suggested that particular conservation unit is presented and reported out on separately because that enhanced population has enhanced spawning grounds there, and so that's something that folks want to keep as separate from the wild population. So in that case, yes. But for other watersheds, we haven't encountered that, and more of it is related to the access of that information, whether or not we can access hatchery releases and that sort of thing, but not something that we necessarily aren't open to including. I know in some preliminary conversations with Fisheries and Oceans Canada that they've offered to share the data that they have in terms of hatchery releases and point locations and that sort of thing, so it's something that could be added in the future, and I know certainly that would be something that would be of interest to many. So no in the short term with the exception of the Babine, enhanced Babine Conservation Unit, but certainly something that we are hoping and open to considering for other watersheds.
Thanks, Katrina. So I'm going to read one comment that just came in from Celine, and I'm also putting up a poll, which I haven't tried before, so I hope that works. Celine has commented, it will be important to strengthen monitoring to promote collaboration and coordination within a given watershed. Ministry of Environment and FLNRO are working on a collaborative process in Northeast BC under the Northeast Water Strategy. Depending on the success of this initial strategy, a similar approach could be used elsewhere in the province. Thanks for that comment, Celine. So I've put up this poll, and it looks like people are responding, so that looks like it's working. And we have lost a couple people from the line, but as I mentioned at the beginning of this call, this session was really meant to kind of kick off further, more detailed conversations that might need to happen at a regional level or sectoral level. So it'd be great to get your feedback on if you'd be interested in being involved in more of those detailed follow-up sessions. And it looks like there's quite a strong interest in that. So thank you once again, everyone. We will make the presentation available along with a summary in the weeks to come. There's also the web links here. I've shared a number of the ones that we've mentioned today and that we've talked about, along with a couple others. So definitely do, if you have some time, check those out and stay tuned for our follow-up from this session. And thanks again to our speakers for their fabulous presentations and for taking the time to be part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Natasha.